Okay, so NVIDIA. I mean, everyone knows NVIDIA, right? They're
Right.
like the big, the name in graphics cards. I'm sure most of our listeners are using something powered by an NVIDIA GPU right now.
Probably, yeah, in some way.
But we're not here to talk about, the latest and greatest in gaming graphics. We're going a little more esoteric today. We're talking quantum computing. And NVIDIA is making some really interesting moves in the quantum world.
Yeah, they're sort of, well, I wouldn't say quietly because they've made some pretty big announcements recently.
Right.
But they're taking a very specific approach to quantum computing. They're not trying to build the quantum computers themselves.
Which is interesting because, I mean, you would think with their resources, their engineering talent, they could jump right into that race. But you've been knee-deep in all the recent announcements, the articles, even some expert opinions on this. And for our listeners who are, fascinated by these emerging technologies, but maybe don't have a PhD in quantum physics, and we're going to try and unpack this, unpack NVIDIA's strategy in a way that makes sense and hopefully makes it clear why this is so important, even if quantum computers still seem like science fiction to a lot of people.
It's a smart strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that really struck me is that they're really playing to their strengths.
Okay.
NVIDIA has just an incredible amount of expertise in parallel processing with GPUs. And that's a huge part of what's needed to, eventually build a quantum computer.
Right.
So instead of diving headfirst into trying to build a quantum computer themselves, they're really focused on building the ecosystem around it, the tools, the software, the infrastructure that everyone working on quantum is going to need.
I love the analogy of the gold rush.
Oh, yeah.
It's not always the people who are digging for the gold who strike it rich. It's the people selling the shovels and the pickaxes.
Exactly.
NVIDIA is positioning themselves to be the supplier of the tools, the essential tools that everyone in that quantum gold rush is going to need. And their CEO, Jensen Huang, he's made this very clear. Their goal is to be the largest quantum computing company in the world that doesn't build a quantum computer.
And the interesting thing about that is that he's not, he's not being dismissive of quantum computing at all.
Right.
He's actually been very vocal about the potential of quantum computing.
Right.
But he also has this realistic, long-term view. He said that truly practical quantum systems are probably still about 20 years away.
Okay.
And so NVIDIA's taken this approach where they're saying, okay, while all that's happening, we're going to build the stuff that everyone's going to need to get there.
Right. So they're thinking very strategically, very long term, and they're not putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Yeah.
They're not betting on any particular type of quantum hardware winning out.
No, they're betting on the whole field.
So let's talk specifics here. We have three main initiatives that NVIDIA is focusing on. The NVIDIA Quantum Cloud, the NVIDIA Accelerated Quantum Research Center, and their existing software platforms, CUDAQ and QQuantum.
Yeah.
Let's start with the Quantum Cloud, because that's been making a lot of headlines recently.
Yeah, they launched this in March of this year, and it's really interesting. Essentially what it does is it allows researchers to simulate quantum computers on NVIDIA's GPUs.
Okay.
So, right now, getting your hands on an actual quantum computer is a pretty big challenge.
Right.
They're still very early stage. There aren't that many of them.
Yeah.
And even if you do have access to one, they're very delicate. They're prone to errors.
Right.
So what NVIDIA is doing is they're saying, okay, let's create this cloud environment where you can essentially simulate a quantum computer using our super powerful GPUs.
And they're using CDAQ for this, which is their platform that a lot of people in the quantum space are already familiar with.
Yeah, CDK is already used by a lot of organizations that do have quantum processing units.
Right.
So it's a familiar environment for them. And it's a way for them to, develop their algorithms, test them, and really get a sense of how they're going to perform on a quantum computer without actually needing access to one right now.
So it's almost like a flight simulator for quantum programmers.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can learn the basics, you can practice your maneuvers, and then when you do get access to the real thing, you're much better prepared.
And it's available through, all the big cloud providers.
Yeah, AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, Oracle.
So it's really, really accessible.
Yeah, and that's the other key thing here. NVIDIA is making this as easy as possible for people to get involved in quantum computing.
And they have some pretty impressive partners already using this. The University of Toronto, for example, they're using it for something called the Generative Quantum Eigensolver.
Yeah, and that's actually using large language models, which is really interesting.
Oh.
So they're using AI to accelerate the process of finding the ground state energy of molecules.
Okay, so I'm not a physicist, but I understand that that's a really important thing in areas like drug discovery and material science.
Yeah, it has huge implications for being able to, simulate new molecules, understand how they behave, potentially design new materials.
So again, even though we don't have large-scale quantum computers yet, the work that NVIDIA is doing is already enabling research that could have, a huge impact down the line.
Absolutely.
And they're not just working with universities. They have partnerships with companies like Classic Technologies, which is focused on designing quantum algorithms, and QCware, which has developed a molecular simulator called Prometheum.
Yeah, and that's a really promising application for things like drug discovery.
Yeah.
Being able to simulate molecules at a much higher level of accuracy than we can with classical computers.
Okay, so we've talked about the quantum cloud. Let's move on to the NVIDIA Accelerated Quantum Research Center. This is their big physical investment in quantum. It's opening in Boston next year.
Yeah, this is a huge investment. They're building a state-of-the-art AI supercomputer there, packed with their latest Blackwell GPUs. The goal is to develop what they're calling accelerated quantum supercomputers.
Okay, now you're just using, science fiction terms here.
Well, it's pretty close to science
So
fiction.
what does that actually mean? What are they going to be doing in this research center?
Well, one of the biggest challenges in quantum computing is quantum error correction.
Right.
Because qubits are so sensitive to noise, their calculations can easily get corrupted, so you need to constantly monitor and adjust them.
Right.
And that requires incredible communication between the quantum system and the classical control systems.
So they're going to be working on the interfaces, the
Exactly.
connections between the quantum world and the classical world.
Yeah, and they're going to be working with some of the leading quantum hardware companies like Quantinuum and Quera, as well as academic institutions like Harvard and MIT.
So it's a really collaborative effort.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that really impressed me about NVIDIA's approach. They're not trying to do everything themselves. They're really embracing this idea of collaboration.
Makes sense.
They're working with the best in the business to try to solve these really fundamental challenges.
And you said that the initial research is going to be focused on things like drug discovery and materials development.
Yeah, I mean, those are two areas where quantum computing has the potential to make a huge impact.
Okay.
But the research center is really about more than just those specific applications. It's
Right.
about developing the fundamental technologies that will be needed to make quantum computing practical for any application.
Right.
And the fact that it's scheduled to start operations later this year just shows how fast this field is moving.
Yeah.
Things are really starting to accelerate.
So we have the quantum cloud, the research center. Now let's talk about the software side of things. CUDAQ and cuQuantum.
Yeah, so these are really the foundation of everything NVIDIA is doing in quantum.
Okay.
CUDAQ is an open source platform that provides a unified programming model for hybrid quantum classical systems.
So it allows you to program both the classical computer and the quantum computer together.
Exactly, and it's designed to support a variety of different quantum hardware platforms.
Right.
So, again, it's that idea of being hardware agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
They're not betting on any particular technology winning out.
Right.
They're building the tools that will work with whatever technology emerges as the leader.
And cuQuantum is specifically for simulation.
Right. quantum is a quantum circuit simulation SDK. It's designed to accelerate the simulations that researchers are doing on classical computers.
And NVIDIA claims that this allows researchers to do simulations that are actually beyond the capabilities of current quantum hardware.
Yeah, they're basically saying that you can simulate a much larger quantum computer than you can actually build right now.
Wow, okay.
And that's really important because it allows researchers to really push the boundaries of what's possible with quantum algorithms. They can explore ideas that they wouldn't be able to explore if they were limited to the size of the quantum computers that exist today.
And they're already being used by some of the big names in quantum computing, like Google Quantum AI and IBM.
Yeah, that's right. And that's another really interesting point.
Okay.
Even though NVIDIA is not building the quantum computers themselves, they're providing the tools that a lot of the leading quantum researchers are already using.
Right.
They're already an essential part of the quantum ecosystem.
So NVIDIA is really, really positioning themselves to be at the heart of this quantum revolution, even if they're not the ones building the actual quantum processors.
Right. They're the ones who are building the roads, the bridges, the infrastructure that's going to be needed to get to this quantum future.
Now, speaking of the future, Jensen Huang, he's been pretty vocal about his timeline for when we might see practical quantum computers. And he's saying it's probably still about 20 years away.
Yeah, and that caused a bit of a stir when he said that.
I bet.
Some of the quantum computing companies, their stock prices actually dropped a bit after he said that.
Right.
But, I think it's important to be realistic about these things.
Absolutely.
Quantum computing is incredibly difficult.
Right.
There are still huge challenges to overcome.
Absolutely.
And I think Huang's timeline is probably more realistic than some of the more optimistic projections that are out there.
Yeah.
And it actually makes NVIDIA's strategy even smarter.
Okay.
Because they're not betting on, some sudden breakthrough happening next year. They're taking this long-term view. They're saying, okay, we're going to build the tools and the infrastructure that are going to be needed regardless of when that breakthrough happens.
Right.
And I think that's a very smart approach.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about NVIDIA's philosophy, their key initiatives, the challenges that lie ahead.
Yeah.
But all of this can still feel a little abstract, a little theoretical. So let's try to ground this a little bit.
Okay.
You've mentioned using some movie analogies to help understand some of these concepts. Let's start with The Matrix. How does that relate to what NVIDIA is doing?
Well, in The Matrix, you have this simulated reality, right?
Right.
And it's a reality that allows you to do things that you could never do in the real world.
Right.
And I think that's a good analogy for what NVIDIA is doing with their simulation tools.
Okay.
They're creating this virtual environment where researchers can explore the possibilities of quantum computing, even though the hardware isn't quite there yet.
So the simulation is like The Matrix.
Yeah, exactly.
And the researchers are like Neo, plugging in and learning Kung Fu.
Yeah, exactly. They're learning how to program quantum computers, how to develop new algorithms, how to explore the potential of this technology.
I like that. What about Inception?
Inception. Yes. So in Inception, you have these layers of dreams, right?
Right.
And each layer takes you deeper into the subconscious. And I think that's a good analogy for the different levels of access that NVIDIA is providing to quantum computing.
Okay.
You have the quantum cloud, which is a very accessible way for people to get started.
Right.
And then you have the research center, which is going to be pushing the boundaries of what's possible with quantum classical integration.
Oh, okay.
So it's like each layer is taking you deeper into the potential of quantum computing.
I like that. And you also mentioned Jurassic Park.
Yes. Jurassic Park.
Which seems a little less obvious.
Well, Jurassic Park is a cautionary tale, right?
Right.
It's about the dangers of playing God with the technology.
Okay.
And I think there's a parallel there with quantum computing.
Okay.
Because quantum computing has the potential to be incredibly powerful.
Right.
But it also has the potential to be very disruptive. And I think it's important to be mindful of that as we develop this technology.
So NVIDIA's focus on, building safe and reliable tools is like building those fences in Jurassic Park.
Exactly.
Making sure the dinosaurs don't get out.
Yeah. They're trying to build the guardrails that will make sure that quantum computing is used for good and not for harm.
Okay. I like that. Now, one of the themes that we've seen throughout all of NVIDIA's initiatives is this focus on hybrid classical quantum computing.
Yeah, and that's a really important point.
Okay.
Because for the foreseeable future, quantum computers are not going to replace classical computers.
Right.
They're going to work together.
Okay.
And NVIDIA is really focused on building the tools that will allow those two types of computers to communicate effectively and work together seamlessly.
So it's not an either-or situation.
No, it's a both-and situation.
And that's where NVIDIA's expertise in GPUs really comes in handy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because GPUs are incredibly good at parallel processing.
Right.
And that's going to be essential for managing the complex interactions between classical and quantum computers.
So NVIDIA is really in a unique position to lead the way in this hybrid computing world.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, for our listeners who might be thinking, okay, this is all very cool, but why should I care? What are some of the potential real-world applications that NVIDIA's work could help enable?
Well, we've already touched on a few of them, like drug discovery and material science.
Right.
But quantum computing has the potential to revolutionize many other fields as well.
Okay.
For example, financial modeling.
Okay.
Quantum computers could be used to develop much more sophisticated financial models, which could lead to more accurate risk assessments and more stable markets.
Interesting.
And then there's cryptography.
Okay.
Quantum computers could be used to break many of the encryption algorithms that we rely on today.
Oh, wow.
But they could also be used to develop new, more secure encryption algorithms.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's artificial intelligence.
Right.
Quantum computers could be used to develop much more powerful AI algorithms.
So the potential here is really, really huge.
It's massive.
And NVIDIA is playing a key role in helping us realize that potential.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, they're not pretending that it's going to be easy. They recognize that there are still significant challenges to overcome.
Right.
Things like maintaining quantum coherence, developing effective error correction techniques, and scaling up quantum systems.
Yeah, those are all huge challenges.
But their approach, this focus on building adaptable frameworks and not committing to any particular hardware path, seems like a really smart way to navigate those challenges.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very pragmatic approach.
And they have the resources to do it. I mean, NVIDIA is a massive company. They have a market cap in the trillions.
Yeah, they're one of the most valuable companies in the world.
So they can afford to make these long-term investments.
Right.
And it aligns perfectly with their core business, which is providing high-performance computing infrastructure.
Yeah, I think so.
So we've talked a lot about NVIDIA's strategy, their approach.
Yeah.
But let's end with a prediction.
Okay.
You've been thinking a lot about this. What do you think? When will we see the first real-world application of quantum computing that demonstrates a clear advantage over classical computing?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's hard to say for sure.
Right.
But I think, based on the progress that we're seeing, I think we're going to see it sooner than a lot of people think.
Okay.
I think within the next 7 to 10 years, we're going to see a real-world problem solved by a quantum computer that a classical computer simply couldn't solve.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot sooner than a lot of the projections that I've seen.
Yeah, I know. But I think the combination of, the progress that we're seeing in quantum hardware, the progress we're seeing in quantum software, and the progress we're seeing in hybrid classical quantum computing, I think it's all going to come together much sooner than people expect.
Okay. And where do you think we'll see this first quantum advantage?
I think it's most likely going to be in either material science or drug discovery.
Okay.
Because those are two areas where quantum computers have the potential to make a really significant impact.
So let's say a new drug that could cure a disease that we currently can't cure.
Yeah, something like that. Or a new material that could revolutionize energy storage.
Wow.
I think those are the kinds of breakthroughs that we could see within the next decade.
So some very exciting times ahead.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's wrap up with a quick recap of what we've covered today. We've talked about NVIDIA's unique approach to quantum computing.
Yeah.
They're not building the quantum computers themselves,
Right.
but they're building the tools, the infrastructure, the software that's going to be needed to make quantum computing a reality.
Exactly.
And they're focusing on hybrid computing,
Yeah.
recognizing that classical and quantum computers are going to have to work together.
For a long time.
And they're making some pretty bold predictions about when we might see the first real-world applications of quantum computing.
Yeah, I think we're going to see some really amazing things happen in the next few years.
Well, I can't wait to see what the future holds. And for our listeners, we encourage you to check out the links in the show notes to learn more about NVIDIA's quantum initiatives and the fascinating world of quantum computing.
Yeah, and let us know what you think. What are your predictions for the future of quantum computing?
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening.